Welcome, everybody. We're going to give it just a few minutes to get everybody signed on to their audio. We have about 25 people registered for this meeting, so we are expecting a few more. But thank you all for joining us this morning. All right. And again, my name is Katie DeMayo. I'm here with AIM Consulting. We're going to bring the PowerPoint up here in just a moment. But again, we're probably going to get started here at about 10:02, 10:03 once we get everybody signed up in here. All right, David, you can bring the PowerPoint slide up. And again, I do still see we still have some people joining us. We're just going to take it slow here at the beginning as everybody is still signing in. You're going to hear introductions from the project team here in just a few minutes, but we're excited to have you all here today with us. Again, my name is Katie DeMayo. I'm with AIM Consulting. We're helping with the engagement here for the EV readiness plan. We're here with our second stakeholder meeting today for the Merced County EV infrastructure plan. Just a couple of housekeeping items to get started. This meeting is being recorded so that we can post it onto the website for anyone who has missed the meeting today, as well as for our note taking and for project purposes. You're going to see that you are muted upon entry. That's to help keep the background noise at bay. You'll be able to use the chat box at any time to answer or to ask any questions. We have plenty of time at the end for a question and answer session. Once we get through all of the questions in the chat box, we'll have an opportunity for you to raise your hand and interact with the project team as well. And so again, I'm going to go over the agenda here now. But again, just want to say thank you all for spending your next hour with us. All right, David, if you could go to the next slide. So here you're going to have a very brief presentation before we go into our question and answer session. You're going to hear from MCAG about the plan overview and why we're doing this and what we're doing here today. You're going to hear from our project team about some survey results, how we're incorporating what we're hearing back from our stakeholders into the input and into the plan. We're going to talk a little bit about our site evaluations. As I mentioned, plenty of time for a question and answer session at the end. And then we'll be sure to give you some next steps on how to stay involved in the process moving forward. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Blake Dunford next to go over the plan overview. Blake?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our second stakeholder meeting. My name is Blake Dunford. I'm an associate planner with MCAG. Also here today, we have Elizabeth Forte, our Director of Programming and Project and Planning. So you will see her pop up in chat here every now and then, but we're very happy to have you all here today. Just as a brief introduction, we're preparing the Community Electric Vehicle Readiness Plan. This is a strategic document to prepare us for a future with more electric vehicles and to have a robust EV charging network throughout the county. I do want to stress this is not an implementation plan. This is a long-term roadmap to help guide us to that network. And so this is essentially the first step in the process. The next step will be to identify projects and funding. And as it says on the slide, once completed, the plan will help to guide our cities to that clean transportation future. Sorry, go ahead, David. And so the EV plan has three main pillars to it. The first is to identify existing and potential electric vehicle charging station sites to support EV adoption. We've gone through and looked at all the sites that are currently in the county, as well as various different potential sites. You'll see later in the presentation, 10 preferred sites, and then a host of other sites throughout the county on a mix of public and private land. We're addressing some of the challenges that are specific to the Merced region, such as the implementation of various permitting policies and funding. We're also working on how we get to that compliance with the state legislation that has been coming down through things like AB 1236 and AB 970. And last but not least, of course, the plan is to educate and inform the community, stakeholders, and the public sector staff about their associated infrastructure. I'd like to hand it over now to our consultants at Wildan, to Taylor and David.
Awesome. So my name is David. I am a project manager at Wildan, and my colleague Taylor is our clean mobility manager. And we're going to be taking you through the rest of the presentation here. So just to give some updates since our last stakeholder meeting, we have continued our outreach and engagement with surveys and pop-up events. We've also developed conceptual project layouts and construction cost estimates for those public sector stakeholder sites that Blake alluded to. We've also analyzed our suitability analysis for the top scoring EV charging station potential sites and looked at what some of those would look like. And finally, we've completed a draft of the EV plan. Jumping right into our survey results, the survey was live from April through July and received a total of 77 responses. Most of those responses came from homeowners, but also we had a significant number of responses from renters and business owners as well. And just some of the key takeaways that we wanted to see were where the community wanted to see more of these EV charging stations. Common amongst these respondents were the desire to see them in commercial areas, as well as at public parking lots and garages, both at around 70%, as well as at personal residences and public recreation areas like parks. A number of people, 43%, said they knew that they could install a charger at their home, but a large percentage said that they weren't sure whether it was for financial barrier reasons, skill and kind of technical issues in installing chargers, or if they were just renters at a house or an apartment and not sure if they could do that. So that kind of speaks to some education opportunities the cities in the county can take to educate their citizens on, yes, they can install chargers at home. Here are some incentives and ways to reduce the cost, as well as ways to install it. So that'll bring me into the next section of the results here, the barriers to adoption. Some of the top reasons that people said that they didn't want to purchase an EV were limited charging network, the capital cost of purchasing an EV, as well as range anxiety, which are all very common barriers. About 50% of respondents indicated that their primary workplace does not have EV charging stations yet. And there were some general anti-EV sentiments noted in some of the open-ended comments, suggesting that there will be some late-stage adopters. We think that there's a lot of opportunity for education amongst the citizens in the county here. As I alluded to earlier about installing a charging station for renters, under California law, in most circumstances, renters have the right to install EV charging stations at their residences. There's also a number of incentives and rebates available that reduce some of the capital costs of installing chargers at home. And most survey respondents were not aware of major incentive programs. Finally, there were concerns over the total cost of ownership, owning an EV and battery replacement. Battery replacement cost is definitely a significant thing with EVs, but we do typically see that the total cost of ownership of EVs is usually lower than an internal combustion engine vehicle due to lower maintenance costs, the incentives to cover some of the capital costs, and fuel costs are typically lower. So we think that there's a lot of opportunity to reduce some of these friction points and get the county citizens more comfortable with EVs. Lastly, about 50% of surveyed commercial and apartment property owners are not planning to install charging stations, primarily due to cost and also finding qualified contractors. So once again, another education opportunity here about the incentives available, as well as potentially, putting up a list of some of the qualified contractors in the county that can help install charging stations at some of these larger commercial areas or residences. And just to recap some of these barriers to adoption, in red here were the major ones that we saw in the survey: the maintenance costs and fees of EVs, the capital cost of purchasing an EV, as well as anti-EV sentiments in general, are all things that we think can be kind of dealt with through engagement and education with the community. That lack of public charging network is a real thing right now, but that's what this plan is working to address, and we expect to see a lot of chargers going up in the near future. I'm going to hand it over to Taylor to talk about some of our site evals.
Thanks, David. So yeah, just as an update on what we've done since our last stakeholder call, we've continued to develop some of those potential EV charging station projects with our public sector stakeholders. And so with these concept projects, the approach is to really recommend the appropriate quantity, power level, and placement of EV charging stations, accounting for potential places where we would connect to power, as well as ADA considerations. And then we've put together some construction cost estimates for those potential projects to really help inform budgeting. We want to note that the construction cost estimates don't include potential soft costs like design or construction management. And they also don't account for potential incentives. So there's a lot of, it's a starting point, and those costs usually start to get refined once someone starts to get into design and they've got a partner to help them bring in different incentives. Incentives are constantly changing. And so that's why we left those out, because those typically come into play more in the implementation stage. During the last stakeholder call, you all suggested a couple of other sites that we should look at. And so we did, and we will provide a summary of our analysis there. And then, as David also mentioned, we took a deeper dive into the results of the suitability analysis that we presented for high scoring sites that may also make good candidates for public EV charging stations, just likely not at publicly owned sites. Next slide. So I'm showing just a couple of examples here on what our concept projects really look at, so you get a sense of what the deliverable these stakeholders are getting. And so it's really it's an overlay of where the charging stations, we would recommend them to be placed, accounting for things like ADA. We can see where we would recommend dropping any potential electrical infrastructure like panels or transformers. These layouts were reviewed with the public sector stakeholders, and where we needed to, or where we got feedback, we adjusted them. In some cases, the sites knew that there were going to be potential changes or specific use cases on the sites where our initial placements wouldn't have been ideal, and so we made those adjustments in the final versions that were sent to the stakeholders. Next slide. So now I wanted to talk about a couple of the sites that were brought up during our last meeting for us to look into a little bit more. And so the first one was the intersection at Highway 33 and Highway 152. This was brought up as a site that could really serve, a potential site for DC fast charging, because we're now at the intersection of two large travel corridors in the region. And so this intersection would make a good potential option for a DC charging hub to support travel across the region. However, we do identify several challenges if this project were to move forward. One is that at this intersection, there are very limited amenities. And since most vehicles may take up to 30 minutes to charge, you want to have, it's ideal to have some other amenities like food or recreation for the drivers while we're there. And there was a couple of small cafes that could serve that, but it was very limited. The bigger constraint here is that when we reviewed PG&E's grid capacity, there is no spare electrical capacity in the area. As you can see from the overlay, there's not a lot that's really built out here. And so that's, to a degree, not very surprising that there isn't a large amount of spare electrical capacity. When we think about a DC fast charging hub, that would be appropriate given the travel patterns here. We would need, I would say, at minimum 600 kilowatts if we're thinking about a NEVI compliant build out. But if you were to expand that, you could be looking at a couple megawatts worth of load that those EV chargers would need to draw from. And given the rural nature of the spot, we estimate it could take PG&E 18 to 24 months to make the upgrades on their system to be able to provide that power needed to support potential DC fast chargers. There's also not a lot of publicly owned sites out here. I think there's a county fire department not too far off of this intersection, but we would likely expect a site like this to be owned and operated by the private sector, potentially in partnership with the public sector. So this may be something where if this project were to move forward, would want to outreach to someone like Tesla or Electrify America to see what kind of interest they may have at a site like this. And the other site that came up was to look at sites that would support travelers going into Yosemite, into the Yosemite Park. And so when we looked in the area, Planeta was really the last urbanized area leaving Merced, kind of last urbanized area in the county on the way into the park. And so we have a potential, this urbanized area could also be a potential DC fast charging spot, really as sort of the last charging opportunity before you get into the park along Highway 140. Because this is a little bit more built out, there are a few more commercial amenities right off of the highway. And if we thinking about a NEVI compliant build out, you want to be within that mile radius of the highway. And so there are some other options in this area that would be a relatively short drive off of the highway for a charging opportunity. There is some more grid capacity in this area. It's not completely tapped out, but again, if we're looking at upwards of a megawatt of charging, there's likely still going to need to be some upgrades available. So we may need to think about either a smaller DC fast charging build out, or again, engaging PG&E early to see what it would take to increase the capacity needed to support that load. And like the other site that we considered, we may also want to think about bringing in private partners to develop, own, and operate any DC fast chargers. So I'm going to turn it back to Dave to talk about the suitability analysis results that we've dug into.
Awesome. So this probably looks a little bit familiar. I believe we showed something similar in our last stakeholder meeting, but we have done some updates. So just to give a refresher of what we're looking at here, this is the site suitability analysis for the county. Basically, we scored each parcel of land on a variety of criteria, such as population density, median household income, number of chargers that are already located around each parcel, to find the parcels that are most attractive for the installation of EV charging stations, where that would be most valuable. What we've added to the map are the public stakeholder sites that we've identified, which we saw some of the concept layouts for earlier, and potential high scoring sites. So we looked at the actual results and output of the analysis and looked at all those top scoring sites and tried to see which ones had nice parking lots, were located near amenities, things like that. And those are in the orange boxes here pictured. So a good number of sites now to look at on this map. We've also got some zoom ins here because it is quite a large map and it's hard to see some of that detail. But these will be updated to the MCAG GIS data portal for, they'll be viewable on there. Just to jump into some of those, we tried to analyze a number of sites in each of the major cities in the county, as well as looking at some of the census designated places for some potential EV charging spots. As you can see from the site descriptions, we've looked at a variety of things, but really tried to take into account that stakeholder feedback from last meeting, but as well from the survey results for the types of places people wanted to see chargers. So we've got some commercial areas, hardware store, gas stations, commercial areas, supermarkets, churches, schools, places where people are gathering, etc. Depending on the site, we recommended between 2 level 2s and 10 level 2 chargers, depending on how large the lot is, basically. And if there were any sites that were quite close to a major highway with low dwell times, we recommend that for anywhere between 2 and 4 fast chargers. And just on the right here are kind of 2 of the examples of what those sites might look at. They've got nice big parking lots and somewhat larger dwell times, so they could make for good charging spots. Once again, most of these sites are owned by private organizations, so it requires some of that partnership and outreach to see if those organizations or companies are interested in installing chargers. And then we've got our suitability analysis, but with a rural preferred scenario here. So we're scoring sites more highly in the rural areas that you can see on the map in the dark blue. And we've added those same 2 layers of the red circles for the potential public stakeholder sites, as well as the high scoring sites from the suitability analysis, but this time with like the rural angle in the orange boxes. And this will also be available on MCAG GIS data portal. And then here are some of the sites that we've identified as high scoring from the rural preference scenario. A couple of these were at farms or businesses that are in kind of rural areas, as well as grocery stores, some commercial parking lots, church here and there. You will notice one of the major differences here is that the recommended EV charging station solution and ports are primarily fast chargers, and that's because a lot of these sites are close to major highways or thoroughfares in the county and could be good places for people to hop off the highway and charge up for a little bit while proceeding on their journey. So that's kind of the difference here, and you can see that a lot of these are on the highways just from the pictures on the right. I think even the Azusa Market is right off the highway as well. So good potential fast charging locations, many of them at businesses or private enterprises. So some of that outreach will be needed to help get charging projects going there. Just to give a recap kind of all of these different sites, stakeholder and suitability analysis sites that we've analyzed throughout the course of this project. In our last stakeholder meeting, we showed some various pathways for how many chargers, both level 2 and level 3, the county is going to need to prepare for the number of EVs that are expected as more adoption occurs. What I'm showing here in the table on the left is the estimated charger needs from kind of a mixed pathway of level 2 and level 3 chargers, but know that this can kind of vary. You could do more level 2s and fewer level 3s, or vice versa, right? But in total, about 4,000 chargers. So once again, the sites that we selected and revised were through continuous discussions with stakeholders, working with the various cities in the county, through feedback from our first stakeholder meeting and the survey results. We also looked at sites based on how highly they scored in suitability analysis, as I reviewed earlier. And in total, we reviewed about 300 level 2 sites, or level 2 ports, sorry, and about 45 level 3 ports, which if all of these were installed or developed as a result of these recommendations from this EV readiness plan, it would get the county to about 10% of its charger goal, 2030 charger goal. So a significant part of the way there. And now I'll hand it back to Taylor to talk about some EV charging station ownership models.
Thanks, David. One thing that I did want to just piggyback off of the suitability analysis that we did, again, taking into account the stakeholder feedback, when it comes to equity in this region, one of the things that came up was geographic spread and equity. And so that is another factor that we took into account when we were reviewing those sites. And so I hope that you were able to see that on the 2 maps that we showed. Now, when it comes to actually getting these chargers in the ground, there are a variety of ownership models that may be available, and some work will lend themselves better to certain projects. So we wanted to review these because it's one thing to get the charger in the ground. It is another to actually own and operate these chargers, depending on the use case and what the site host desires. And so I'm going to review some of the highlights of a couple of different options out here. And so the first is the host owned and operated model. And this is probably what most people will think about when they're thinking about adding an EV charging station to their property. Is they will pay for the charger, they will pay for the installation, they wholly own and operate it, and they will collect all of the charging revenue, and they are typically responsible for all of the operation and maintenance costs, things like the cost of electricity and costs for repairs. This is probably the simplest model to understand. It provides the most control over the charger for that site host, but potentially carries the most risk. On the opposite end of the host-owned model is the vendor-owned and operated model. And so this is the case where a charging vendor like a ChargePoint or a Blink or another developer is the entity that will own and operate that charger over that charger's lifetime. So typically the vendor will pay for all of the material and installation costs, and they typically retain the right for most, if not all, of the charging revenue, and they are responsible for any operating costs and maintenance costs. This model may lend itself very well to sites that are expected to have very high utilization of those chargers, because this is going to be a situation when the vendor is looking to have a return on their investment on that charger. So they may not be willing to, this model may not be viable in certain cases if the utilization is expected to be low. But for certain cases, it can provide a no to low cost way for a site to get EV infrastructure installed. In some cases, the vendor may act, this can actually create a revenue stream for the site host because the vendor may be willing to lease parking spaces from them, or share, or if that's free, maybe share a percentage of the charging revenue. So this is sort of the other end of the option. And then there's sort of a middle ground of this hybrid host vendor ownership model. And this is when it's going to be a little bit more of a negotiation between the site host and the charging vendor over who takes responsibility over the installation costs, the electricity costs, and the maintenance costs, how any revenues are split up. But if sites that want to have a little bit of skin in the game and want to have some element of control, and maybe a little bit more revenue without taking on all of that ownership risk, this could be a potential option. And then the last option or typical ownership model that we see is called charging as a service. And so this is also a vendor owned and operated model. We typically see this not so much for public EV charging, but more for large fleet electrification projects. I believe the UC Merced was on our call on the previous stakeholder meeting, and they had talked a little bit about their fleet electrification efforts. And so for something like that, the charging as a service model may be applicable. It's very similar to a power purchase agreement for solar PV. And so under this model, the site host may pay a little bit upfront to get the charging infrastructure installed, but they're not paying that full cost. And instead, they're paying that cost back over time to the vendor via the cost of electricity. So the vendor will basically roll up all of their infrastructure installation costs into the cost of electricity. So you'll pay a little bit more for the electricity, and that extra fee is how they get their money back over time. Again, it's what if this is a model where if the site host does not want to be responsible for operating and maintaining the chargers, it could be a viable pathway. And so as EV charging stations start to get installed in the county, these are different options that may be available to the site hosts, both public and privately owned sites, when it comes to ownership and operation of these charging stations. I think we can go to the last slide. And so that was the last slide of content. And so we wanted to lead in with a few different discussion questions. And so just to quickly recap what we've done in the plan, we've we sort of identified the long-term charging needs. We've started to identify a couple of sites that might make good candidates for EV charging. We've done some initial outreach and engagement to understand what the local barriers are. And so we've seen that one of the major barriers here is increasing awareness. And hopefully as awareness increases, adoption will soon follow. And so as we work on finalizing the plan, we wanted to start to hear from you on what has worked well in this region for other types of energy projects. Things like energy efficiency or solar. Are there tactics that have worked well that we could replicate for EV infrastructure? So I'll pause here and let you all start to talk a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Taylor, David, Blake, for the presentation. Yes, we're going to pause here for a second. We want to give you some opportunities to put some questions into the chat box. Again, we're going to be on this call for the next half hour to answer any questions about the plan. We can go back to any of the maps, as well as you can raise your hand and interact with the project team by asking us a question as well. And so if you don't know how to raise your hand, you can go to the reactions button on the toolbox of your Zoom. It looks like a little smiley face for some, and you should be able to raise your hand through there. I also put, and I'll put it again, the project website into the chat box. We want you all to stay involved with us there as well. But please let us know any questions or raise your hand. All right, we got our first hand. Let me see if I can find it. Ah, Stacy.
Hi, good morning. This is Niron. I'm actually sitting next to Stacy. I'm the Public Works Director, City of Los Baños. Good to meet you guys. Sorry I jumped in a little bit late, but you know what we've been doing a lot in Los Baños, kind of relying a little bit on the California Building Code. So you know we have quite a bit of developments happening in town. So all of our new houses are EV ready. So if the homeowner decide one day to buy an EV vehicle or whatnot, there is infrastructures to the house. But one of the biggest challenge for us is just like your second question is the barriers to commercial property. Luckily for us, we're right in between Highway 152 and 165. So a lot of our commercial property get a lot of highway traffic. So a lot of those properties see the benefit of solar, like Target and Walmart and stuff. Target specifically has been pretty aggressive in installing EV infrastructure. So, you know, they kind of taken on those projects on their own and been putting that up. We've also started to see some commercial property like kind of like Travel America, kind of like the gas stations and things where they like to attract some of the commuter coming in. We have ones on the east side of town that coming up with like a quick serve coffee shop kind of thing. They have built a dog park, and as part of their stops, they included a bunch of EV charging stations to go along with those to really have attract some of those commuters that might not necessarily come to Los Baños, but just need to have a quick stop to charge up their vehicles. So that's what we've seen kind of successful. But in terms of locally for what to serve our resident of Los Baños, a lot of our commercial properties really are not that enthused about installing new infrastructures, maintaining them, or just taking up their existing parking spots.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's fantastic information.
Thanks, Carol.
And so, yeah, again, we would love to hear from people if you all have interacted with the surveys, if your community members, how they're feeling about the EV infrastructure plan or some partnerships in the area. Again, we have plenty of time. We can end the meeting early here in a little bit, but we would love to answer any questions you might have while we have the project team available. All right, John.
Hello, everyone. John Seymour with the City of Atwater. So I was just kind of curious. This is less, I guess, of like a EV, I guess, placement question and more of a broader question. But obviously, we talked about capacity in the existing power lines there, like at that site at 152 and 33. Is there plans for the state to increase capacity in various strategic areas to kind of support these EV charging stations in the locations we've identified, or at least locations the state's identified?
The short answer is yes. Utilities are taking into account future EV charging loads into their load forecasting and identifying where upgrades may need to be made. Now they are using kind of their models and their forecasts that may or may not necessarily line up with some of the sites that we've identified here. And so it would, for example, like highway, the 152 and 33 intersection, that may be a site where a project stakeholder, when they're trying to develop it, we'll need to reach out to them very early to see what it would take to get that upgraded, or if PG&E is already working on something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if it might be good to have them at a future stakeholder meeting, or maybe engage CPUC with other energy providers to see what can be done right now as far as the planning stage goes. But thank you.
Thank you, John. All right. Yeah, Marlon. Hi, Marlon.
Hey, Katie, how are you doing?
Good, how are you? Good to see you here.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me. And folks, if you guys don't know me, my name is Marlon Regis for Caltrans District 10, Deputy for Planning, Local Assistance Environmental. I do have two other Caltrans folks here, Mary Renji and Hilda Souza. We are very much interested in this, and thank you for allowing us to participate. But I do have a question in terms of the sites that you guys are looking at. They are, of course, it seems like most of them are very close to our highway, especially in Planada and Dos Palos. But is there opportunities that you guys have studied that may be within Caltrans right of way or adjacent to it? Because I think we'd be very much interested in partnering with a partner agency, if possible, to move forward with EV charging installation infrastructure. I think that's something that the state is very much looking at, but for Caltrans specifically, we do have interest in partnering and providing EV connectivity in strategic locations. So I guess specifically, I don't know if there's any parcels or areas that are Caltrans owned that you guys have looked at in the past, but just wanted to share that we're open for partnering on this. So
yeah,
appreciate it.
So we didn't look, that was not a specific factor that we considered in our analysis, Caltrans owned properties. What we can do, or what maybe a good next step at the conclusion of this project, is the maps that we created will be uploaded on Merced County on MCAG's GIS data portal. So if you were able to download that once it's up and then overlay that over your property list, you then start to create a list of sites that start filtering out for high scoring sites that are Caltrans right away. And then you've got a starting point to dive deeper. And then from there, you can start to identify potential project partners for implementation. Sounds like a really good next step.
I'll just add on to that briefly. We're actually in the process of putting that data up on our website right now. There's currently a placeholder, so unfortunately you won't see anything right now, but we're hoping to get that up by the end of today so that you'll be able to see those maps and be able to play with the data layers there. Also, there are a few sites that are very close to Caltrans right away, especially Los Banos, Gustin, Dos Palos, and like you mentioned, Marlon, in Planada and in Silmar. And so we would certainly like to work with you to identify different sites that may work for everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate that. It's exciting.
Yeah. Thank you, Marlon. Thank you. All right, looks like Mary has raised her hand. Hi, Mary. Oh. Mary, I think it's prompting you to try to unmute.
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I just want to add add to what Marlon just stated. We have National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure NEVI program. So that EV charging stations on private sites along interstates, 50 miles or less, and no more than 1 mile from corridor. So alternate fuel corridor, 1 mile from any state corridor. So NEVI program opportunity. So if I'll look up the map one more time and see if there are locations that's close to, like, within 1 mile, so NEVI program opportunity is available. I can share NEVI program information with you all just to utilize that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Mary.
David, I think we included NEVI compliant criteria in the suitability analysis, right?
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Oh, it's part of the program study?
Yes, it was a factor in the suitability analysis. Sites that were NEVI compliant received additional points. And so they would have scored higher on the list.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yep. I'm seeing a question in the chat, Katie, if you want me to jump on that.
Oh, yes.
Steve.
Hi, Steve.
The question is, are there going to be any grant programs for school districts to install chargers? Yes, there are programs available. So the EPA, for example, has programs for electric school buses and charging infrastructure. The utility PG&E also has a program for behind the meter infrastructure to provide rebates and subsidies on that cost. local air quality districts may have additional grant funding opportunities available. There's always a bit of a hodgepodge of there's usually not a silver bullet for these types of projects. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different funding that you kind of cobble together, but there are programs available for school districts, particularly on their fleet side. Public side might be a little, maybe a little bit less so, and maybe more based on local funding opportunities.
Wonderful. Thanks, Taylor. So yeah, again, if there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll be here for the next about 15, 20 minutes. So Steve also wants to know, how will we push this information out to the school districts? I mean, I could help with that for sure. But usually you would partner with school districts and with their superintendents and have some stakeholder meetings with Blake and his team on that high level. And then we could, again, when we are looking for outreach, at least from my end, outreach from the school districts, we use flyer deliveries and are able to interact with the school that way. But I know Blake interacts with the schools as well.
Yeah, so like Katie said, and we would like to reach out to the school districts, especially with one of our primary 10 sites listed is that Bernard Marx School in Dos Palos. So we would like to engage the school districts in different ways that we can provide these chargers in the future. This is definitely, like we've said, the first step. And so now it's going to be about reaching out to all these different agencies to see what are the most feasible projects at this time and how can we secure the funding. But we're looking forward to working with you, Steve.
Great. Maybe we can bring the slide up for some of the next steps, just to make sure that people know where we're headed from here in case there's any last questions circling around. And again, we have plenty of time, but we do have some next steps that are involved in the process. And maybe Taylor, you can chat about where we go after the draft plan and when we'll see them next.
Yeah, so we're getting kind of close to the end of this project. So we've got our draft plan out. I believe Katie sent that out to all of you either late last week or early this week. The plan is also up on MCAG's website. Will be up for 30 days for public comment. Blake, I think that went up last week or early this week.
Yes, it went up last week. So we will have it open for public comment through September 1st. And please submit your comments in writing, either to Katie, to Taylor, or to me. I'll drop my email in the chat. You can also send it by traditional mail to the MCAG downtown office, which I'll also include their address.
Great. So, yeah, and so as we collect those comments, we will incorporate that into the final plan. I think what I've listed here are some of the, again, wanting to make sure we really get that local touch on some next steps that we can include in the plan to really facilitate implementation are, you know, any case studies or lessons learned that have worked really well for like these targeted outreach programs would be really, like, that is one piece of feedback I think we would be very interested in hearing from you all that we can incorporate into this. Along those lines, any previous experience with public-private partnerships, which can be a great way, especially for some of those DC fast charging projects, which are very capital intensive. If any, we are open to any kind of thoughts or lessons learned, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. We'd love to get your feedback on that as we finalize the plan. And then, of course, open to any other general feedback, comments, or questions on the project.
Great. And Blake, you just messaged that to me. I'm going to put that in the full chat. No worries. All good. And yeah, and we just put in the chat box, you can email any comments directly to Blake, or you can mail them in via snail mail as well. But again, we would love to have you interact, read the draft plan, let us know any questions you might have. If anyone didn't get the draft plan, please let me know. It was sent out first thing on Monday morning with the reminder to this for this invite today. But again, we really are encouraged by the feedback and all of the survey results that we've heard so far, and we really look forward to continuing this conversation. So again, we're going to stay on this call here for the next about 10-15 minutes in case there's any last or final questions. But I just really want to thank everybody for spending their time with us for the second stakeholder meeting, for interacting with our survey, with our project team. And please stay tuned to the project website and to your email for future invites to stay involved. Taylor, we'll keep it open here just for a few minutes. But again, really, that's the end of the presentation here. So if you don't have any other questions, I just want to say thank you all for joining. We really, really appreciate your time on a Friday morning. I hope you all have a nice, cool weekend. Hopefully the weather is getting a little bit cooler in the area. Up here in Sacramento, it's about to heat up. Not okay. Thanks, Marlon. And so, yeah, you feel free to sign off if you give yourself some time back on your day here today. And thank you guys so much for your time.